The Iron Purity are a loyalist successor chapter created from the proud lineage of the Ultramarines, supposedly created as early as the Second Founding, following the bloody civil war of the Horus Heresy and the subsequent Great Scouring. An honorable and dedicated chapter, the Iron Purity have continuously fought the enemies of mankind for 10 millennia, standing as a bulwark between realm of the Emperor and the encroaching darkness of the ruinous powers. Founded after the Horus Heresy in 021 M31, the Iron Purity are a chapter with troubled origins. Only a few members of the chapter's command staff know who their primogenitor is, although they are increasingly rare to hold this information. Their origins suggest that they are the Ultramarines' descent, although this has never been confirmed by any institution of the Imperium or the Iron Purity itself. They have been working in the region of the Segmentum Ultima for 10 millennia, going where their talents are needed. Their origins are sufficiently fuzzy to make each chapter master fear the impromptu visit of the Holy Inquisition. Since the almost total loss of their archives, they also lost all traces of their primogenitor. Their traditions, as well as their affinities with certain strategies, reinforce the fear of an unenlightened ancestry among the brothers. Notable campaigns: War of the Beast, 545 M32. It is known that the chapter took a very active part in the defense of the borders of the Segmentum Ultima and Solar in the face of the assaulting moons of the Beast. The nature of the engagements was mainly spatial, given the strength of the chapter fleet at that time. Several incursions were thus promptly annihilated at great cost by the chapter's responsiveness in defending their Segmentum. Woe of the Iron Purity, 923 M32. The chapter came close to extinction and lost almost all of its archives to an enemy of unknown nature. None of the chapter's veterans survived, and the Iron Purity went into a long period of military inactivity to rebuild. It is likely that during this time, the chapter holed up in an uncharted system and conducted recruitment raids in the surrounding systems before heading to a familiar world such as Katorsha. It is also theorized that it was at this time that the Terran Tertia station was claimed by the chapter to defend the far banks of its territory. It remains unclear how many years or centuries this forced settlement lasted, but it is possible that this time span could be counted in millennia. Age of Apostasy, Crusade of Wrath, 238 M36. There is no clear record of the Iron Purity's actions during the Age of Apostasy, but it would appear that their activities took a more radical turn. They claim that they spent most of their time pursuing and eradicating Astartes chapters that had turned to the powers of ruin during this dark period. This quote-unquote crusade would have cost the chapter a great deal of money, which explains the lack of documentation of this period according to them, but also the creation of the Red Rampart and the reinforcement of the protocol to guard against corruption. It is also possible that these confrontations radically changed the mindset of the Astartes of the time, as the chapter seems to have reverted to a nomadic lifestyle, abandoning their adopted territory and world, Katorsha. The Undying Legions, 112 M37. The chapter was confronted with the emergence of a minor Necron dynasty in the eastern fringe of the Segmentum Ultima. This is officially the oldest official proof of a Necron awakening known to date from the Imperium. The chapter lost almost the entire deployed company. First mention of the term Abomination of Living Iron listed in the chapter's archives following the trauma of its confrontation and the unknown nature of the species not listed at the time. The Tau Empire, 018 M39. First meeting of the chapter with Tau specimens. The archives mention an intrinsic disagreement of point of view that led to the end of the transmission. It is reported that the fleet encountered was destroyed by the vessels of the chapter and that no further research was carried out in view of the quote-unquote insignificance of this xenospecies. Defense of Ultima Segmentum, from 350 to 500 M41. Numerous minor engagements throughout the Segmentum. The meager detail of the archives does not allow for a complete and detailed chronology of this period. However, many scholars agree that it was during this time that the chapter last passed by Katorsha without lingering and abandoned its static mode of operation in order to be able to intervene throughout the Segmentum. Death of Aliendros, 700 M41. The chapter was confronted by a large greenskin horde in a subsector not mentioned in the chapter's records of the Segmentum Ultima. This confrontation led to the death of the chapter master Aliendros and the appointment of Ivander Cestius as chapter leader. The losses reduced the Iron Purity to 2 companies after more than 3 centuries of uninterrupted conflict throughout the Ultima Segmentum. A succession of campaigns to exterminate and pursue the surviving greenskins responsible for Alejandros' death were carried out in retaliation. Simondis Epsilon Campaign, 838 M41. First encounter between the Iron Purity and the Sons of Shadow chapter. The Forge World Simondis Epsilon is then invaded by a war skins of importance. Faced with the challenge of this new purge, the two chapters collaborated effectively to free the planet. It was during this campaign that Seraphus Ackland met his mentor, who taught him the basics of Sons of Shadow training, essential to his survival behind enemy lines. There is no record of how the overall conflict unfolded or how Seraphus Ackland and Alice E-Ray became trapped by the Orcs. This is probably due to the highly secretive nature of the Sons of Shadow chapter. The chapter archives do not explain the presence of the Sons of Shadow there, nor whether they were contacted by the Iron Purity in the first place. The War of G18A19, 902 M41. Gathering their forces on the frozen world of G18A19, unknown to the Imperium, a warband prepares to launch a raid against the kingdoms of Ultramar. The heretics use a special demonic device to haunt the dreams of the surrounding systems and convince Imperial citizens and soldiers to turn to the dark gods in their sleep. Disturbed in her visions by the nightmarish device, the great prophetess Denali orchestrates the arrival of Hector Adrian's newly promoted company of the Iron Purity on G18A19. Supporting the Adeptus Astartes first from the shadows, then openly employing a squadron of fire prisms to annihilate the heretic base, adding their firepower to that of the Whirlwinds and the chapter's Land Raider. Despite the Eldari's initial manipulation, Hector chose to leave without further conflict, complementing the firepower of their casual allies before leaving, entrusting the Eldar with the chapter's distress beacon in case future cooperation is needed with the Zenus. Hector adds that he would rather help knowingly than be manipulated. The Treachery of Garanis, 099 M42. The Iron Purity engaged in the defense of the Garanis system against a massive greenskin invasion after receiving a distress call from the Garanis Tertius Throat World. It took 6 months to repel the Zenus, but the losses were great, not from the Orcs, but from a more insidious threat that revealed itself at a worst possible time. Securing the advance of the first and third companies of the chapter was left to the second company alone, which, while reinforcing the planetary capital of Garanis Prime, was attacked from within by heretic space marines belonging to the traitorous Iron Warriors. This unexpected confrontation resulted in the loss of more than half of the second company's strength. The Forge World of Garanis thanked the chapter for its intervention and sacrifice by presenting it with 4 relic armor models of the Cataphractii Terminator. MN-12A Disaster, 100 M42. Immediately following the conclusion of the Garanis campaign, Iron Lord Evander Cestius responded favorably to the call for the crusade in the Venexian sector. Even as the chapter prepared to depart, a phantom echo on the fleet's omens forced the Iron Lord to exercise caution by changing his original flight plan to a longer one based on tortuous detours between different systems. This decision was motivated by the weakness of the chapter after the bloody Garanis campaign. This took the chapter to an uncharted and unnamed system that proved to be home to an awakening Necron dynasty. With the chapter's fleet initially undetected, a reconnaissance mission to the surface of the newly designated planet MN-12A, Necron World 12 found, system position Alpha. In the time it took to send the reconnaissance force of scout squads, the chapiteral fleet was spotted by Necron patrol ships, which gave chase. The Iron Purity retreated, leaving the scout squads behind on the surface of NN-12A. Hector Adrian refused to leave the future of the chapter behind and disobeyed orders to return to the scene to extract the scouts from the Inferno. Accompanied by Regulus Coves, the Iron Paladin led the assault on the planet's surface and recovered the neophytes and Instructor Sergeant Ackland in extremis, escaping with the help of the chapter's fleet at a critical moment. This event marks the first rift between Hector and Evander and the arrival of the first Iron Purity. Incidents of Carcerum, 100 M42. A few months after the disaster of MN-12A and the chapter's involvement in the Fulminata Crusade, the Iron Purity attempt to pacify the penal world of Carcerum, which is plagued by an invasion of greenskins who fled the Garanis system after the chapter's passage. Even before the first confrontations, Iron Lord Cestius received confidential information about the probable presence of a chaotic sorcerer orchestrating the revolt of the millions of inmates of Carcerum. In order to get to the bottom of it, Evander commissioned Seraphus Ackland, now a paladin of Sombre, a company specializing in assassination, sabotage, and infiltration missions, to go and investigate the depths of the planet's prison system. Hector Adrian was assigned to pacify the surface of the cultist world, and it was under these conditions that Confessor Selena Ivanova of the Ordo Hereticus revealed herself to the chapter, forcing the hand of the Iron Lord and leading to the death of the Iron Paladin Nicodemus Lazar, after the decision not to send reinforcements to Hector when he requested them following a massive orc assault on the surface of Carcerum. This event will mark a pronounced distance between a majority of the chapter's members towards the primaries. After a number of close calls, the survivors of the Third Company rallied Seraphus in the depths of Carcerum and were able to capture the wizard with the help of a red rampant killer. When Hector finally returned to the fleet, he learned of Lazar's death and the loose details of the story. He will make his disgust with Ivander's decision clear to Evander and will become Ivander's designated successor for many. While the Iron Lord is paralyzed by indecision between his desire to continue the crusade at the risk of being accused by the highest authorities of the Venexian sector of being responsible for the loss of Carcerum and his desire to preserve the chapter by fleeing the sector, fate will show itself to offer him a way out. As the chapter prepared to flee the Carcerum system, a communication reached the Iron Lord from none other than Lord Commander Robuta Gilliman himself. He orders the Iron Purity to lead a crusading force to liberate a minor sector bordering the Great Rift in the name of the Emperor. The chapter then sets out for the Sarbedia sector. The Betrayal of Sigma, 101 M42. Data not found. Crusade of the Worlds of Sarbedia, 101 M42. Like the many crusades that have shaped the history and territory of the Imperium, the Crusade of the Worlds of Sarbedia was a vast gathering of disparate forces from across the God Emperor's domain, especially since it was part of Primarch Robuta Gilliman's Indomitus Crusade. Without the others, none of the Imperial forces present could have succeeded alone. During the campaign, the Imperial forces, spurred on the Imperial propaganda machine, were dubbed the Saviors as the first ships gathered at the edge of the Chaos-controlled territory. From the youngest recruits of the Astra Militarum to the remarkable titans of the Collegia Titanica, to the devoted and loyal sisters of the Adeptus Sororitas, to the legendary battle brothers of the Adeptus Astartes, the Sarbedia Worlds Crusade enjoyed a variety of fighters, a double-edged sword. Indeed, while variety offers a range of strategies, weapons and thoughts to deal with many situations, it also brings with it the independence of some of the multiple agendas of others. Politics was one of the main internal enemies that the Triumvirate enjoyed during the conflict. The rediscovery of the Behemoth, 111 M42. As the Sarbedia Worlds Crusade came to a bitter end, the Iron Purity set out for the Sarbedia Gate to regroup and rebuild their forces. During the journey, the fleet had to make a stop to regroup their ships for the final approach to the Kotorsha system. The journey went smoothly, but a scan of the transition zone revealed a huge ship adrift. Upon analysis, it was a super heavy cruiser Avenger. The name of the ship was still visible on the hull, Behemoth. An expedition was hastily assembled to explore every corner of the ship with the goal of capturing it to reinforce the chapter's fleet. This region, lost between two solar systems, was an ideal hiding place, as few navigators made such a stop to regroup several ships before the next jump. So it was with good luck that the Iron Purity came upon the Behemoth, but capturing the Behemoth was not going to be easy. The cruiser was overrun with hibernating Tyrannid organisms. The first skirmishes took a heavy toll on the chapter's vanguard troops. Reinforcements from across the fleet descended upon the super-heavy cruiser to purge its corridors of the Xenos that infested them. The purge lasted for days, but all traces of the Gene Stealers had finally been eradicated. The ship was finally towed into orbit on the moon of Kotorsha for extensive repairs. The power of the Behemoth would prove to be a valuable asset to the chapter's fleet. After the catastrophe of the Home War, the Behemoth was hastily repaired before the chapter's hasty departure. Although this decision was often questioned by some of the chapter's officers, any challenges were quelled by the Iron Lord, who argued that it was time to go on the offensive against their longtime enemies. The necessary repairs would be made as the fleet moved and the Forge Worlds were encountered. The Field of Steel, 112 M42. Following the Sarbidia Crusade and the loss of Evander Cestius and Gabriel Cardas, the Iron Purity chapter found itself greatly weakened. The chapter invited their chapter masters to beautify them alongside the King's Fangs, who were also mourning the loss of Kalish Clovis. On the world of Karos, the funeral took place, with the bodies or remains of the chapter masters lying side by side in sarcophagi, covered by their respective chapter banners. Hector Adrian spoke first, recalling Ivander's inflexibility both as a leader of his people and during the events of Sarbidia. He said that he had always made the right decisions, that he had always served the interests of the Imperium and the chapter above all else until the very end, and that he would make it his duty to follow his teachings with the same selflessness. Following Hector Adrian's speech, a fleet was spotted in orbit, and the information was immediately transmitted to the Astartes convoxes on site. The solemn and truly unique moment that the Battle Brothers were experiencing had just been disturbed by an unwelcome guest of the worst kind. There was silence until several ships in space were struck by masses of flesh with mouths and fangs. All the Astartes drew their weapons and took up defensive positions. The remains of the Tyranid Spen had just arrived in the planet's orbit. From the battle barges, the Marines battled the Zenith ships with some difficulty. Meanwhile, the situation on the planet was even more perilous, as the protection of the bodies of the former chapter masters forced the Astartes to hold an extremely disadvantageous position, and many of them fell while defending themselves. Hector was nearly impaled by the sharp limbs of a burrowing creature, but was saved by Harold Morova. The King Fang deflected the attack with a swipe of his blade and sliced open the Zenith's torso before moving on to another target. After dozens of hours of fierce fighting, victory was achieved, and the King's Fang's captains present chose Harold to go up to the square where Hector had made his speech and do the same. He had distinguished himself during the Sarbidia World's Crusade and during this battle. Hiccup gave a poignant speech to his brothers, one that resonated in the hearts of the Iron Purity as a reminder of their own condition. After the King's Fang's rite of passage was completed, the actual coronation of Evander Cestius was performed. In the vast foundries of the Redemption Stars, the body of the former Iron Lord was plunged into the molten metal, slowly sinking and his face sinking into the yellowish flames. The heat around his frozen face clouded the air, and some thought they saw a parting smile on Cestius' mouth, one of confidence and certainty. The events of the common celebrations bound the chapter together with bonds stronger than blood, becoming eternal allies in the midst of the endless war. Hector and Harold embraced each other like brothers and pledged their loyalty. A tradition was born, honoring each other's dead as if they were his own whenever the two brotherhoods crossed paths. Each chapter was now willing to do anything to assist the other, even if it meant abandoning their personal goals. The honor of each chapter was at stake, and each meeting between the two chapters was always a celebration, punctuated by ritual duels and the sharing of past exploits. The Home War 113 M42. After the grueling crusade of the worlds of Sarbidia and the campaign of the Steelfield, the chapter decided to travel to their preferred recruiting world, Katorsha, located in the heart of the Sarbidi Gate. Hector Adrian, newly appointed Iron Lord, wished to establish himself there for a time in order to replenish the chapter's numbers until it was up to the standards of the Astartes Codex. This decision was seen as the first step towards the renewal of the chapter envisioned by Evander Cestius. As the Iron Purity left the Sarbidia sector to travel to the heart of the Sarbidi Gate to join their recruiting world of choice, the chapter fleet spotted strange emissions of unknown energies at the edge of the system as soon as they entered orbit. Before the Iron Purity could react to the strange emissions, a huge black ship with emerald lines and a crescent moon shape appeared before them. Hector Adrian, just elevated to Iron Lord by the chaplains of his company, recognized the battleship as the one he had encountered on MN-12A, and fury seized him. He was both eager to fight and upset, for the sighting of the cairn ship in this system, so far from MN-12A, could not be a coincidence. It meant only one thing to Hector. The Necrons of this dynasty had been tracking them since MN-12A and had been waiting for an opportunity to reveal themselves. For Iron Lord Hector Adrian, the space battle was a losing proposition given the firepower of the starship Cairn and its escort. So he took a risky gamble. lure the tomb ship's escorts behind the Katosha womb moon, and land all of the chapter's companies on the moon's surface to establish a fortified position as only the Iron Purity could do against the Necrons. This, he hoped, would keep the Necrons away from Katosha and its population, while still having the advantage of position. The starship Cairn stayed back, not far from the moon, while its many escort ships chased the chapter fleet. Both sides were eager to do battle with each other, eager to get revenge or to finish unfinished business. Once on the surface of the mining moon of Katosha, the Iron Purity quickly took up position in one of the planet's more isolated manufacturing districts. Almost immediately, they received reinforcements from the Mechanicus, who had been there for eons. The Mechanicus did not know that the Necron's presence was a result of the chapter's arrival, but that did not seem to matter, as the followers of the cult of the machine were thrilled to have an opportunity to get their hands on Xenos technology and artifacts. The chapter had little time to establish and strengthen its defenses, for already countless Necron legions had set foot on the moon. What followed was a tedious siege in which the fighting did not stop for a second. The staggered defenses held, allowing the chapter to make several retreats and countercharges with the help of the Mechanicum's machines, and the Iron Purity's habits of supply allowed the Astartes to hold the line without fail. Casualties were still high, however. For every living iron abomination the Iron Purity killed, hundreds more arrived, and hour after hour, day after day, the Iron Purity lines retreated in the face of the living machine's relentless onslaught. On the verge of total annihilation, with their last line of defenses down, the Iron Purity were narrowly saved by the intervention of the chapter's returning ships, which began a bombardment of enemy positions on the moon's surface. The Iron Purity's ships were not alone, however. A large number of ships from the Imperial regiments and the dreaded Knights of Valgast arrived from orbit in a storm of flame and shells to cover the surviving Astartes. The battle was fierce and costly, but the Xeno machines inexplicably retreated and left the system in a hurry, while the outcome of the battle was still undetermined, if not in favor of the Xenos. What remained of the chapter took on a much more belligerent and stubborn attitude, convinced that they were being persecuted all the time and that they could not take the years of rest that the chapter needed to rebuild its numbers and reserves. Fleeing forward, 113 M42. Beyond this point in the story, little is known about the movements of the chapter, as it once again abandoned the Katosha system. According to the most recent reports from the Inquisition, the chapter was headed for a deserted system already visited by the chapter long before the Sarbedia Crusade. These reports do not explain their motives, but assure the loyalty of the Iron Purity. It is likely that, under the impetus of the new chapter master, the Iron Purity embarked on a vengeful crusade against all their enemies who had bullied them for centuries. This event was later known as the Vindicta Crusade, and was intended to fulfill the Iron Purity's age-old vengeance against all those who had the audacity to stand in their way. The Vindicta Crusade, 115 M42. No longer able to maintain their nomadic lifestyle, which has offered them many advantages in exchange for losses that are difficult to replace without a fixed base, the Iron Purity are at a low ebb, even with the Primaris reinforcements they received shortly before their arrival in the Venexian sector. Iron Lord Hector Adrian decides to call upon old and new allies of the chapter to exterminate the Xenos and heretics that have been haunting the chapter for several years now. The first target of this vendetta is of course the Necron dynasty of the system named MN12A by the chapter, and having inflicted a serious setback on them in the heart of what was once the chapter's domain, Katosha. This crusade is primarily a way for the chapter to regain morale and honor they feel they have lost since the Garanis campaign, but more importantly, to rid themselves of a serious threat to the Imperium, the Ultima Segmentum, and the chapter. To do this, the Iron Purity must still take time to build up their strength, so Iron Lord Adrian will plan a tortuous path for the Sarbedian Gate, taking the fleet to safe zones and forge wells with which they have good trade relations, while sending astropathic messages to their allies. This vengeful crusade was quickly perceived as more personal than altruistic. To this, the Iron Purity vehemently replied that this vengeance was long overdue, after millennia of selfless and costly fighting. This burning desire for revenge was the root of many minor conflicts among the factions involved in the Necron extermination. This uncharacteristic attitude of the Iron Purity would isolate them somewhat from their allies until they felt they had received retribution for their past suffering. However, This attitude changed when they finally approached the Garanis system, the last stop before MN12A, which had fallen into the clutches of the Amektha dynasty from MN12A several years earlier. As the Iron Purity investigated the surrounding systems, they became aware that the awakening of MN12A was complete and that the Necrons had not remained idle. The living iron abominations had taken over half a dozen systems close to their own, making it difficult for the chapter's crusade to succeed. The Iron Purity were strongly influenced by the conduct of the Ultramarines when their chapter was created. Wishing not to repeat the mistakes of the past and in a perpetual quest for redemption, they always act in a logical, coordinated and relentless way, taking into account the risk of casualties, whether in their ranks or amongst the civilians of the Imperium that they protect. The Iron Purity do not have a homeworld. The chapter fleet and the battle barge, Redemption Star, serve as a mobile fortress monastery to the chapter. No one knows where their stubborn refusal to settle on a fixed world comes from. The chapter had, until recently, only a total of 3 companies of 100 Astartes and 2 scout squads. Although this figure is correct, it did not take into account all the chapter Astartes that were assigned to the orders of the various ships of the chapter fleet. Following the events of MN12A, the chapter will undergo a reorganization in depth and an increase in the number of Astartes within it. The newly assigned Primaris Space Marines have different markings than the ones usually used by Iron Purity. Where the chapter identifies color scheme, the Primaris Brethren grades via shoulder and/or knee markings. The rank of the Primaris is color-coded on the helmet, leaving the right shoulder pad without any markings other than the various squad specialist icons to distinguish what role a Primaris brother is currently assigned to. The difference in marking is most certainly due to a desire to respect the Codex Astartes as heirs of Guilliman. The difference is only one of the causes of the mistrust of certain members of the chapter with regards to the Primaris Marines. Although the majority has accepted their presence, there are still differences, both in terms of tradition and habits, that are not concerned with full respect for Codex. The Iron Purity Primaris wear on their armor the original gold color of the chapter. Those of the ancients, having tarnished with the millennia of existence of the chapter, lean more towards the bronze to see the orange. On the 2 Primaris companies, Ivan de Cestius made the decision to leave the captains who led them when these reinforcements reached the chapter. They were named Iron Paladins and were instructed to abandon the old denominations of ranks. Although this obligation had little impact on both companies, most Primaris brethren still make the mistake of calling their Iron Paladin Captain. On the other hand, it fits very well with the help of Iron Paladin Hector Adrian, the only Iron Paladin to have welcomed Primaris into his company, and the Dark Iron Paladin Seraphus Ackland, who selected the most promising elements for integrate the company of Dark Iron. Only the officers have the ability to select the few potential recruits who will join the ranks of the chapter. The selected recruits must then complete, among other things, the Ritual of Forging, a challenge in which the recruit must compete against an Astartes of the chapter. Only the current chapter master, Ivan de Cestius, would have beaten the Astartes who faced him when he was a young boy. If the child is deemed too weak, unworthy, or simply has no potential for the chapter, he or she is either sent back to his or her world within the hour or kept as a chapter serf. On the other hand, if the child shows talent and reflection in the face of a normally hopeless battle with an Astartes, he or she will be accepted and integrated into the group of neophytes who begin their first psycho-conditioning sessions. Each neophyte is seen as an extremely valuable resource, and their lives are not wasted. All the brothers in the chapter take care of them without showing it ostensibly. Following the events of MN12A and the arrival of Primaris reinforcements, Ivan de Cestius decreed that the recruitment of novices would be less strict in order to ensure the future of the chapter, where it had almost disappeared on Tomb World MN12A. From then on, every world with a harsh climate crossed by the chapter was the object of recruiting young boys to be Astartes, regardless of the opinion of the chapter officers. This way of doing things made it possible to replenish the ranks of the present 6th Company to the detriment of a rigorous selection of recruits. Some officers believe that the strength of the future Astartes will only be a shadow of the strength of the Marines who preceded them. The recruitment of future Primaris is left to the Iron Paladins Primaris of the 4th Company. This mark of independence from the chapter is intended to facilitate the integration of the Primaris Marines by entrusting them with the full and complete charge of their company. This freedom was badly perceived by the officers who refused their presence among their ranks, sometimes going so far as to question the decisions of the Iron Lord. This tradition will continue under the authority of Hector Adrian and will eventually be fully encouraged. The Primaris apothecaries were also instructed to pass on information concerning the biology of the Primaris to the older apothecaries of the chapter, in case the Primarist apothecaries were not present to look after their brethren. Combat doctrine. The Iron Purity put all their knowledge into the art of siege and the destruction of strongholds in the Segmentum Ultima. Their combat doctrine focuses on static position wars like the Astra Militarum. Artillery shelling and the regular use of heavy weapons as well as explosives make them a chapter as effective in the art of siege as in taking and maintaining position on a conventional battlefield. Although the Iron Purity compensate for the small number of Astartes deployed in the field by a strong supply line and a highly effective and foolproof logistical support, allowing them to progress in the various theaters of operations they are responsible for. Chapter Protocol. Confrontation. In the event of disagreement between two members of the chapter having different ranks, a chapter officer must arbitrate the dispute through a series of ritual questions relating to the nature of the dispute, so that the two parties no longer speak directly but can freely express their disagreements without prejudice to the protocol governing the hierarchy. The problem must therefore be solved so as not to risk hasty and counterproductive decision-making that would hinder the smooth running of the future chapter operations. The confrontation can be triggered at any time and usually results in a silent face-to-face meeting between the two parties until a third-party officer asks the usual questions. It is not impossible that the confrontation could end in a deadlock. In this case, an officers' council meets and both parties are deprived of their ranks and privileges until a solution is found. This solution is most often in favor of the most senior officer of the two parties in this very rare case. However, the greater the hierarchical gap, the more misunderstood the confrontation will be by the chapter as a whole. In theory, a simple brother of the rank can therefore confront the chapter master, but the consequences for the brother would undoubtedly be more important than the potential gain. The judgment. By my life and my honor, I defer to your judgment. This formula has a very strong impact within the chapter and is only used very rarely because the person who uses it seeks to make his interlocutors understand his willingness to prove full acceptance of his mistakes and the consequences that result from them. This protocol formula is not used lightly because it allows those for whom it is intended to have the fate of the person who pronounces it. Thus, the one who pronounces this formula literally risks dying in the minutes that follow. The greeting. Iron Purity. Although this sentence is normally the rallying cry of the chapter, it also serves as a greeting. Salvation is used against a superior, a mentor, or simply a person respected by the person who employs it. This respect for the protocol and for the person being greeted is widespread within the chapter. The person greeted in this way, however, is not governed by a mandatory response rule and may not respond with the following formula: "Still will be our will." Like the answer, salvation is not systematic and can be replaced by a more informal salvation, such as the sign of Aquila. The duty. You have done your duty to the chapter and the emperor. This formula serves, in theory, only as a constant reminder to Iron Purity of their objectives. In practice, this formula actually serves to remind the Iron Purity what the original renegade legions betrayed, the chapter being the representation of the Imperium. Thus, whenever a chapter Astartes thinks it has failed in its duty when it is not, this formula is there to make it clear that only the chapter, the Imperium and the Emperor matter. However, this is only one of the many possible interpretations of this formula. Being the most obscure and paradoxically the most used of all, it can also be used to honor a chapter member for outstanding service. This set of rules may seem unnecessary or considered a waste of time, but the origin of the creation of this strict framework was, above all, motivated by a desire that the chapter should not fall into the same trap as the treacherous legions, should not make the same mistakes as these, and should lead it to betray its oaths. The dubbing. Within the chapter, a tradition has been going on since its foundation. The Iron Paladins and the Lieutenants, once appointed to one of these posts, are officially recognized as such by the rest of their brothers once they have been knighted by the two chaplains of their respective companies in a long private ceremony with the two chaplains as sole witnesses. During this ritual, the future superior officer discusses at length with the chaplains any subject can be discussed, from the apprehension of the Astartes to find himself in a position of importance to question of a more philosophical or religious nature. The two chaplains take the time to answer any questions and discuss them as brothers would. Then, the two chaplains collect the oaths of fidelity and service from the Astartes, which are all the more strengthened once any doubts they may have are swept away by the chaplains. This tradition can last from a few minutes to several days depending on the individual. The Iron Lords. The tradition remains more or less the same for the endowment of the Iron Lords of the chapter. Apart from the two chaplains present in the room, there is also the lieutenant of the former Iron Paladin who is dubbed Paladin at the same time as the future Iron Lord. The two brothers meet for a few hours on equal terms and share their feelings with each other as much as with the chaplains. The two Astartes take an oath of eternal fidelity in the presence of the two chaplains, one as Iron Paladin and the other as Iron Lord. Then the ceremony resumes its normal course, and this for as long as the two men need. The Iron Purity are only looking for one thing: death in battle in the face of an innumerable enemy and alongside a handful of respected brothers. It is only in the face of a similar situation, where there is no longer any hope of escaping alive, that the Astartes of the chapter reveal their full potential. Once against the wall, in small numbers, in front of an opponent so numerous that it becomes impossible to count him, joy seizes them. The prospect of the challenge of winning as many opponents as possible before passing through the chutes in a lucid frenzy. The wounds do not slow them down. The death of a brother only reinforces this desire to kill as many enemies as possible. The distance combat is shortened in order to bring the enemy into contact as quickly as possible, and this in order to let speak all the violence of which the chapter's battle brother is capable. More than once, Iron Purity squads have found themselves in the situation where they should not have been able to get out alive. And yet, as they like to tell it, the challenge was not equal to their talent. Hate of the living iron. All the Astartes of the chapter, whether they are veterans or simple brothers in rank or scouts, are affected by a deep aversion towards the Necrons. The strangest thing is that even those who have never faced them directly seem to feed this hatred. Many chapter apothecaries have examined the subject without finding an explanation for this behavior. Recently, the chapter's chief apothecary, Maximilian Dersius, put forward an interesting theory on this subject. The implants of a space marine are transmitted at the death of the latter, so it is not impossible that the Iron Purity that succumbed during the first meeting of the chapter with the Necrons is transmitted through their progenoid glands, a kind of heritage of hatred for those responsible for their death. This legacy would then have been passed on from one seafarer to another and would have spread throughout the chapter. Only the Primaris do not seem to be affected by this aversion, reinforcing the credibility of this theory because they have never shared the genes of the chapter. This theory, although it opens up many avenues for reflection on the emotional transmission capacities of Space Marine implants, is strongly contested within the chapter itself. Since the chapter is based on a fleet and cannot rely on the resources of a dedicated world, Iron Purity spend a lot of time recovering as much material as possible from wherever they can, be it in the still smoking ruins of a battlefield, a drifting shipwreck, or on an asteroid, even if it's a bit rich in minerals. It is, in part, for this reason that the capital fleet moves in small successive jumps through the warp, hoping that luck is on their side and stumbled upon something worthy of retrieving resources. The recent discoveries of Selena Ivanova, confessor of the Ordo Hereticus, in searching the fragmentary archives of the chapter, have gathered much valuable information to trace the genetic origins of the chapter. However, given the importance of this information, the confessor decided to conceal it after consulting with Ivan de Cestius, Iron Lord of Iron Purity at the time. The only tangible information that can be known about these famous discoveries is that the Iron Purity Primaris do not share the same genetic heritage as their non-Primaris counterparts. In order to avoid any further problems, it was decided, in view of the loyalty proven time and again by the chapter Astartes, to place the origins of the chapter under the taboo of the Inquisition. As a result, any investigation targeting the Iron Purity will now be impossible, except by a member of the Inquisition who has irrefutable proof of the need to reopen an investigation.